Do you guys do any exposure response prevention therapy?
Sure, we do that. Let me first broaden out a little bit. I noticed that in your questions that we make use of exposure therapy more generally, very liberally and broadly. That we use it for all of our kids. And exposures is a broader term that you can use for any kind of real life or simulated practice situation where you try to expose or engage a child into a situation that they find challenging, and you try to make it as close to real life as possible. That could be for the purposes of simply going into a situation and learning that you can tolerate the distress and realize that, wow, this is difficult, but I can bear it. It can also be to practice coping skills that we teach, like noting where you might be scanning the room and being hypervigilant for risks and threats that you might be exaggerating, and then challenging those thoughts. It could be by going to an experience and realizing, oh, that wasn't as bad as I thought, and cutting off the rumination that often follows these experiments. So we do use exposure liberally. We do it both in the clinic as well as try to go to live places, and use it often as a way to practice some of those coping skills that we've taught the kids. Response prevention is a specific technique that's mostly associated with OCD, with obsessive.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So what response prevention assumes is that there's some sort of specific behavioral response that you're trying to prevent. So if you have an intrusive thought or an obsession like contamination fears, like, oh, if I touch this table, I'm going to get coronavirus. Then if you touch that and then immediately you have the thought, okay, now I have to go and wash my hands 3 times, or I have to actually do 3 Hail Marys, or I have to actually write down a nursery rhyme 3 times. What you're trying to do is then evoke those same fears through exposure, getting them to touch things that they think might be contaminated, and then prevent the actual compulsion from happening, right? And so that's what, so response prevention assumes there's a specific thing that you're trying to prevent. Okay. In all the exposure, there's some kind of behavior we're either trying to encourage or prevent. So I guess in that way you could consider it response prevention, but it's not technically. Usually it's more associated with OCD.
Okay, so then exposure therapy for, say, a school refusal child would be just called exposure therapy?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. Thank you for clarifying that.
And for school refusal, the way that it would look would be, it could look as one, just like graded reentry. So if we are creating a hierarchy of goals for the kid to try to get back to school, it could include things that start as basic as reestablishing morning routines and building up their ability to get up out of bed, get into the bathroom, et cetera, while reinforcing with rewards as well as giving practice at coping. And then it could ramp up to getting to the school grounds, sitting in the parking lot for X amount of time, sitting just in the attendance office, going through the hallways, going into classrooms on off days, going into classrooms during the day. So you can continue to increase it, and ideally either you have the therapist there or a deputized therapy, like a parent helping them, or a counselor moving them through their steps. And so that's how we would use exposure for school-specific goals. But as you mentioned, like with your son who has social anxiety, you can also do exposures for the underlying causes. And so you would create exposures that have the child confront social interactions and all of its different forms, and learning how to tolerate that distress, and learning how to rethink the situation differently. And so exposures get used very liberally in our work.
Right. When my son was working with a few different therapists, they did exposure therapy, but the therapist sent him to do a lot of it on his own, which was a failure.
Yeah.
He couldn't do it on his own.
Right.
So
Yeah, I think that really just, and you know what, and I don't want to disparage any therapists who are trying.
yeah,
You know, it depends on their setting. There might be some institutional limits that some therapists in private practice might not have the ability to go out and
right,
have a flexibility, and other people in hospitals might have different rules. For sure, the way that we plan, we are fortunate. We work on a university campus. So there are always other people around. There's lots of different activities and facilities. And so we can usually make use of the campus to serve as a testing ground for a number of things that kids and teens, you know, that disrupt them. And then we go to try to go to live places as well. We'll go on site to them, to different places, whether it's a store, whether it's playground, whether it's a school, and so that we try to coach them through those situations as well. You know, when we did this work in cities, you make use of public transportation and other
right.
sorts of things and other storefronts. And that's what we think the role of a good cognitive behavioral therapist is to do it live.
Yes,
Assigning experiments for homework helps support the work, but what you want to do is really be there when they're struggling, so that you can get a realistic assessment of what holds the child back and where their stuck points are, and then B, what you want to do is really coach them through those moments so that they can get over that hump. So I agree. I think I'm glad that that the word of exposure is expanding and people are trying to adapt it to whatever contexts that fit them. And at the same time, we know that it's much more beneficial if you can do it with them in the moment.